The night air hung thick over the Georgia marshlands, heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant pine smoke. Beneath the chorus of frogs and the low hum of cicadas, there was another sound, something faint, almost mistaken for the whimper of the wind. Some said it was the call of an owl. Others swore it was a woman weeping beneath the cypress trees, her voice echoing across the still water. That voice had a name once, Miriam Holt. In 1841, the Holt plantation stretched across the banks of the Oconee River, its fields blanketed in cotton and silence. The land, owned by Judge Franklin Holt, was known less for its wealth than for the fear it inspired. Those who worked its soil were bound not just by chains, but by the kind of hopelessness that etched itself into their bones. Every whisper carried weight. Every look could mean punishment. Miriam was different. She carried herself with a restraint that unsettled the overseers. Her silence was not submission, but observation. She noticed everything, the clicks of the lock on the supply shed, the pattern of the overseers' walks, even the rhythm of the dogs' patrols at night. Born on the plantation, she had never known freedom, yet there was something unbreakable in her, like a song that refused to fade completely. She had been married 3 times, each union carved by grief. David, her first, was sold south 2 years after their vows. No word ever returned. Stephen was whipped until his back no longer bled but festered. Samuel vanished in 1839, a shadow swallowed by the woods, after he defied an order to bow his head. Miriam had searched the tree line for nights afterward, listening to the distant barking of hounds, praying they were chasing a deer instead of a man. The white folk called her the widow of the quarters. Some mocked her quiet mourning. Others avoided her completely. There was something in her stare that made even the cruel men uneasy, as if she saw straight through them to the rot eating at their souls. On the evening the legend began, a storm gathered over the hills. The plantation workers hurried to tie down the shutters and bring the horses in, but Miriam stayed behind near the cypress grove. She had gone there often since Samuel's disappearance, always at dusk, always carrying the same torn piece of cloth from his shirt. The other women warned her. Those trees held bad spirits. The ground beneath them was uneven, heavy, and veined with old roots that never stopped feeding. But Miriam said little. The only sound was her whisper carried by the wind. "You promised me forever." When the first thunder cracked across the horizon, Overseer Whitby shouted for her. She didn't answer. By the time he reached the grove, lightning revealed her figure standing ankle-deep in mud, eyes fixed on the plantation's main house. Rain began to fall, thick and sudden. Whitby cursed and grabbed her by the shoulder, but she didn't flinch. She simply turned to him and said, "The storm's late." He pulled her away toward the quarters, muttering about her madness. But when his hand left her arm, her gaze stayed on the mansion, the white columns gleaming briefly through the rain before darkness consumed them. The fire came that same night. They said it started in the attic where candles were never kept. The flames reached the roof before anyone could act. Panic spread as shouts echoed through the rain-soaked fields. The cries of the children, the snapping of wood beams, the desperate flapping of frightened birds, all mixed into a single night of chaos. And amid the confusion, someone saw Miriam walking slowly toward the big house, her face illuminated by the orange glow, her hands clasped before her chest. By morning, it was gone. The great Holt house lay in blackened ruin, its pillars collapsed and smoke curling into the grey dawn. Judge Holt, his wife, and their eldest son perished inside. No one ever found Miriam alive, or her body. The surviving slaves were sold off to neighboring plantations, scattered like ashes across the county. Yet every few years, after heavy rain, travelers reported hearing it again. The faint cry beneath the cypress trees, a sorrow heavier than thunder, weeping for the dead and the damned. They said she wasn't haunting anyone. She was remembering them, all 1,000 of them. Every husband, every brother, every man she'd lost to the cruelty of others. And though the plantation itself vanished, swallowed by weeds and reeds of the river, the legend remained. Mothers would hush their children at night when the wind moaned through the trees, whispering, "That's Miriam Holt crying again. Don't listen too long, or she'll think you're one of them." But history is not built from legends alone. Beneath the ashes and rumor, truth still hides. A century later, when a new road was planned across those same marshlands, surveyors discovered the remains of old foundations and something else. Tiny fragments of personal items, a brass button, a broken chain, a sewing needle bent from force. And just beyond the cypress grove, they found a circle of stones charred black by fire. The official report mentioned nothing unusual. But one man, the county historian, kept a private note. It read only, "Sound of crying at dusk. Human voice. Does not fade when approached." The story of Miriam Holt begins there, not with her birth or the fire, but with the silence that followed. For some legends do not seek to frighten. They endure because they remember what the living choose to forget. The morning after the fire, the land was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Ash floated over the fields like grey snow, clinging to every surface. The cotton rows, once heavy with bloom, were now streaked with black soot. The sky carried the smell of wet smoke and decay. Even the birds seemed to stay hidden, as if the noise of the night had frightened them into silence. By midday, a group of neighbors arrived on horseback to inspect the ruins. They found nothing left but the stone hearth and twisted fragments of what used to be the grand staircase. The air still vibrated with heat, and the earth underneath it pulsed faintly, as if the fire had sunk roots into the ground. No one spoke Miriam's name, but every man who looked toward the cypress grove thought of it. They didn't say it aloud, not out of respect, but out of fear. Downriver, at the old quarters, a few survivors waited for direction. They were exhausted, their faces streaked with soot, their eyes wide from a night spent running through rain and smoke. One of the younger women, Ruthie, claimed she'd seen Miriam walking toward the house before the fire took hold. "She wasn't afraid," Ruthie said softly. "She looked like she was waiting for it." No one answered her. In those days, explanations were dangerous. The overseer, Whitby, now without a master to serve, took charge and told everyone to keep quiet when the sheriff came. As the lawmen rode through the remains that afternoon, they asked few questions. Holt had been an influential man. It was easier to call the destruction an accident than to seek a deeper truth. Miriam's name was never written in the sheriff's report. Yet her absence lingered more than anybody could have. Even the dogs refused to go near the grove afterward. When forced, they whined and clawed at their chains until released. It was as if the entire plantation had absorbed her silence, one that spoke louder than the screams of that burning night. Weeks passed, then months. The Holt lands were abandoned. The widowed relatives who owned shares wanted nothing more to do with the cursed soil. Nature began reclaiming what slavery had taken. Vines crept up the stone remains, moss covered the well, and the fields returned to wild grass. But deep in the grove, the ground refused to heal. No matter how much it rained, that patch of soil stayed dry and cracked, scorched by something more enduring than fire. Years later, old Ruthie, one of the few who had survived and fled north, told the story to her children. She said that on her last night there, she saw a flicker of light in the grove, faint but steady, like a lantern held by invisible hands. It wasn't evil, she said. It was waiting, watching, like somebody keeping count. No one knew what she meant until generations later, when whispers of Miriam's legend began to resurface. By 1870, long after the war and emancipation, travelers passing through Oconee County reported unusual sounds near the old Holt lands. Some swore they heard women crying. Others felt a sudden chill even in midsummer. The locals started calling it Mourner's Hollow. Hunters avoided it, and preachers declared it godless ground. But one man, a freed preacher named Elijah Reed, decided the truth needed to be faced rather than feared. Reed was born not far from there. His mother used to tell him about Miss Miriam, the woman who had lost 3 husbands and 1 life, all to the cruelty of men. He'd grown up hearing her name like a warning. As an adult, he saw those stories as fragments of a forgotten truth. So one autumn evening, he walked alone into the grove carrying only a lantern and his faith. The air inside the grove was still, too still. The sounds of the marsh vanished behind him. He found the circle of blackened stones that surveyors would one day record, partially buried under roots. The ground felt strange under his feet, soft in some places, solid in others, as if hollow. When he knelt and brushed away the leaves, he found scraps of something beneath the surface. Small bones, unrecognizable but clearly not animal. He thought of prayer, but the words froze in his throat. Then it happened, the sound. A low, drawn-out sob that seemed to rise from behind him, though when he turned there was no one there. The air tightened, the light dimmed, and for a moment he thought he saw the faint outline of a woman near the edge of the grove. Her shape was thin, fragile, yet motionless, like part of the mist itself. Reed closed his eyes and whispered, "If you seek peace, rest." When he opened them, the grove was empty again. He left that night and never returned, but those who knew him said he was different afterward, quieter, older somehow. He rarely preached about heaven again. When asked about the Holt land, he would only say, "Some fires don't burn to destroy. Some burn to remember." By the turn of the century, the legend had passed beyond the local towns. Newspapermen looking for ghost tales wrote of the crying widow of Georgia, romanticizing her pain into a story of tragedy and revenge. But those who lived near the water still knew better. They said she wasn't haunting anyone. She was mourning them, all the men who never came back, all the lost ones swallowed by the cruelty of others. Every time thunder rolled, they said she was counting. Decades later, nature began to swallow the past completely. The old roads cracked, the river shifted its course, and the grove sank deeper into the marsh. But memory has its own roots. Even when the last stone sank beneath the soil, people still felt drawn there, compelled without knowing why. In 1934, during a long drought, 2 children discovered an iron ring buried in the dirt while exploring what they thought was an old battlefield. The ring was attached to a chain, and near it lay a rusted key. The youngest, a boy named Simon, picked it up and said he heard something faint like singing. His sister told him not to lie. A week later, Simon fell ill. He recovered, but for years afterward he refused to go near trees after sunset. In the decades that followed, the world around the Holt lands changed. Automobiles, highways, progress, but the legend kept adapting. Some said the groves were haunted by every woman who had ever loved and lost during the days of slavery. Others believed Miriam Holt herself had been an omen, a soul who carried grief too great for one lifetime. But for the families who could trace their ancestry to those fields, the story was something more intimate. She wasn't a ghost. She was memory given voice. In the mid-1970s, a historian from Atlanta named June Wallace became fascinated by these tales. Unlike the reporters before her, she didn't dismiss the story as folklore. Through months of research, she uncovered plantation records, correspondences, and a partial insurance claim listing the Holt fire as cause unknown. Most shocking was one handwritten ledger from 1841, detailing inventory losses, which included names of the enslaved who perished. 3 columns were left blank under spouses unaccounted for. One of those names, faintly visible beneath smudged ink, read Miriam. June visited the ruins that winter. The cypress trees were still there, their bark twisted and darkened. The land smelled of damp moss and cold ash. As she walked deeper, her tape recorder began to distort. Faint static soon gave way to what sounded like breathing, sharp, deliberate, unmistakably human. June stopped the tape, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Something about the air felt watching, listening. Later, when she played back the recording, she heard her own voice describing the grove. But in the background, faint and rhythmic, there was something else. Not words, not music, just the sound of someone breathing and at times a soft sob. The tape cut off on its own. June never released the recording. She kept it locked in a box for the rest of her life. Miriam Holt's story became her final research project, unfinished yet unforgettable. Before her death, she wrote one last note to her students. If grief has an echo, it must live in places like this. Her voice isn't haunting us, it's reminding us. And so nearly 2 centuries after that storm, people still come quietly to stand among those trees. They do not seek ghosts but understanding. They say that when the air turns still and the water mirrors the sky, the grove hums with something alive. A wind that moves against the breeze, a whisper that carries the rhythm of heartbreak. Some stay until dusk listening, others leave before the night grows too deep. But every now and then, someone claims to hear it clearly. The voice of Miriam Holt beneath the cypress trees, not crying anymore, but speaking softly like someone counting under her breath, reaching the 1,000th name and then at last falling silent. By the mid-1980s, the Holt lands had disappeared beneath the creeping advance of the river. What once stood as the heart of wealth and oppression was now a stretch of half-flooded earth, where cattails swayed over dark, unmoving water. But the locals still warned travelers not to linger after sunset. The stories hadn't gone quiet. They had only grown patient, like the land itself. That year, a construction company secured state approval to build a new highway extension through Oconee County. The proposed route cut directly across the overgrown area, once marked as the Holt plantation. No one paid attention to the old stories until the ground itself started pushing back. The chief engineer, Richard Lawson, was a practical man who believed in what could be measured. On the project's third week, he received reports of equipment malfunctioning near the old Grove site. Bulldozers stalled for no mechanical reason. Compasses spun erratically, and the workers began complaining of strange noises after dusk. One man claimed he heard a woman sobbing just over the hum of the diesel engines. Another swore he saw movement among the trees where nothing should be alive. Lawson dismissed it as imagination. But when their excavation uncovered the outline of an old foundation, stones fused together by something darker than soot, he decided to document it before continuing. Among the bricks, they found remnants of burned wood, glass fragments, and a rusted locket sealed shut. Lawson pocketed the locket, intending to clean it later, though he couldn't explain why the metal felt warm against his skin, despite the cold morning air. That night, the generators went out. At first, the crew assumed it was another power issue, but when Lawson checked the main switch, he discovered it had been physically turned off. Someone had cut through the safety lock. The camp was plunged into silence, save for the chirping of frogs and the long sigh of wind through the cypress trees. Then came the sound, soft, deliberate, unmistakable. It wasn't weeping this time, but humming. A melody without words, as ancient as the soil beneath their feet. Every man in the camp froze where he stood, listening. In that instant, even the insects went quiet. The hum moved closer, circling them like invisible footsteps in the mud. Lawson turned to the grove and saw it, a faint shimmer between the trees, not quite light, not quite shadow. The air bent around it like heat, though it was freezing cold. He felt the warmth of the locket intensify until it burned his palm, forcing him to drop it. When it hit the earth, the humming stopped. For the rest of the night, no one slept. By sunrise, 2 workers had quit, refusing to set foot on the site again. Lawson filed no report, fearing ridicule, yet he couldn't dismiss the weight that hung over the area. The next day, he returned to retrieve the locket, but it was gone. A week later, the company rerouted the highway. Officially, the change was due to soil instability. Unofficially, no one wanted to dig there anymore. Still, the story leaked out, and once again the legend of Miriam Holt stirred from its uneasy sleep. As decades passed, the area became known informally as Holt Hollow. Explorers, journalists, even self-proclaimed ghost hunters came looking for signs of Miriam's curse. Most found nothing but swamp, mosquitoes, and disappointment. Yet a few recorded things that couldn't be explained. Sudden drops in temperature, fog rising on clear nights, and faint singing caught on tape. The melody was always the same, slow and mournful, like someone rocking a cradle in time with their heartbeat. One such visitor, a folklorist named Thomas Avery, arrived in 2003. His ancestors had lived in Oconee County since before the Civil War, and he'd grown up hearing about the slave woman who cried her husbands into heaven. Armed with cameras and recorders, he camped near the grove on a humid September night. His field notes, later published posthumously, told the rest. He described feeling watched, but in a way that wasn't menacing, more sorrowful, as if someone stood behind him waiting to be remembered. Around midnight, his audio recorder picked up a faint pulse of sound, breathing steady and close. Avery wrote that he felt compelled to speak aloud, to acknowledge her name. "Miriam Holt," he whispered. "I'm here to listen." The wind rose suddenly, bending the grass flat. A low voice, not female nor male, but full of something heavy, answered with a single word. It sounded like "here." Then the recorder cut off. Avery's body was discovered 2 days later, his equipment scattered, untouched by animals. There were no signs of violence. The autopsy listed cardiac arrest, though he had no history of illness. His recorder was recovered but wouldn't play. When technicians later opened the cassette, the tape inside was melted as if exposed to fire, though there were no burn marks elsewhere. The death of Thomas Avery rekindled the legend one last time. Reporters framed it as obsession gone wrong, but those who knew his work saw it differently. His unfinished research, found in the back of his notebooks, contained an unsettling theory. Miriam Holt wasn't haunting the living. She was trapped in a loop of remembrance, her grief replaying endlessly across generations. The grove wasn't cursed, it was a wound. By the time construction resumed near Holt Hollow in the 2010s, few remembered her name. The marsh had nearly swallowed the grove, leaving only a small rise of land where the old stones still showed through. But nature, stubborn as memory, refused to let it vanish completely. Travelers sometimes reported a dim figure standing near the highway shoulder, tall, thin and still, her head bowed. When headlights passed, she disappeared. Newcomers dismissed it all as myth. Yet for those who grew up hearing the old stories, there remained a quiet understanding passed from parent to child. Some places don't forget, because forgetting would be mercy. Today, if you drive the Oconee stretch after midnight, you might notice how your radio hums for a brief moment, how the air turns heavy without reason. Some claim it's just the humidity from the marsh, but if you listen carefully under the static, a faint voice hums with the rhythm of grief, the same unbroken note carried since 1841. They say it's Miriam Holt, no longer mourning her husbands, but every soul ever taken by silence. The woman who wept for 1,000 lives, now bound to a land that refused to hear her living cries. Her voice remains not as a warning, but as a memory echoing beneath the soil, reminding the world that there are fires which never truly die, and griefs too vast to fade. And even now, when thunder rolls across Georgia's low sky, the cypress trees sway as if answering, their roots deep in the past, their branches heavy with stories no one dares to tell aloud. In the early months of 2020, the story of Miriam Holt drifted back into the public eye, not through folklore or whispered legends, but through archaeology. A research team from the University of Georgia began an anthropological study on sites linked to pre-war plantations along the Oconee River. Their goal was to document the remaining traces of the enslaved, communities that had lived and died there. One of those sites happened to sit directly over what had once been the Holt plantation. Dr. Evelyn Shaw led the team. She was known for her careful, methodical work and for her conviction that the ground holds memories. Every layer of soil tells the truth, she often said. The project began in March, under skies heavy with pollen and heat. Within days of excavation, her crew began unearthing fragments, burned nails, shards of pottery, small tools frozen in rust. Each find told a piece of the story she suspected had been lost to deliberate silence. Then came the discovery that changed everything. At the edge of what had once been the cypress grove, an intern struck metal while digging barely 3 feet below the surface. It wasn't the jagged shape of machinery, but something smoother, curved, human-made. With patient hands, the team cleared away the earth, revealing a small rusted object, a locket. Inside was no photograph, only a faded scrap of cloth and a word inscribed in careful script, Miriam. The find made headlines across the state. Journalists flooded the area, calling it the resurrection of Georgia's forgotten woman. Dr. Shaw felt uneasy about the attention, but she couldn't deny the emotional weight of the moment. For her, it wasn't superstition. It was vindication. The existence of the locket proved that Miriam Holt had lived, that she was not merely a name in whispers, but a real woman whose grief and endurance had outlasted those who'd erased her. In the following weeks, the team continued their work. Yet something about the site began to resist intrusion. Tools malfunctioned. Digital data corrupted without explanation. Some nights their batteries drained mysteriously, and their tape recorders played back faint background noise. Breathing, a hum, a soft voice repeating what sounded like numbers. The crew dismissed it as interference, but Dr. Shaw began to make notes of the occurrences. She wasn't frightened, only curious. She believed that stories leave resonance, and perhaps this was simply history trying to express itself. By midsummer, however, tension filled the camp. 2 interns quit after claiming they'd seen a woman walking through the trees during a storm, holding something in her hands. Another woke one night to find her tent unzipped and her equipment scattered, yet nothing was stolen. The next morning, Shaw found fresh footprints in the mud, bare, slender, distinctly human but leading nowhere. She ordered the site perimeter closed and reduced operations. The remaining crew worked only in daylight. Still, Dr. Shaw's fascination deepened. She couldn't stop thinking about the numbers caught on the recordings. When slowed down, they didn't sound random. They were rhythmic, like someone counting softly through tears. She played it again and again until it became an echo in her mind. One dawn near the end of summer, with the others still asleep, she walked alone to the grove. Dew glistened on the grass, and the air held that peculiar stillness before sunrise. She stood at the heart of the clearing, staring at the soil that had swallowed and preserved every story that came before her. "If you can hear me," she murmured, "we've found you. You're remembered now." The response was almost imperceptible. A shift in wind, a tremor underfoot, the faint rustle of leaves, although no breeze had stirred them. A sense of presence filled the grove, neither welcoming nor hostile. Shaw felt tears rise unbidden. She whispered again, "You're free," though she didn't know whether she was speaking to a spirit or simply to the memory of pain embedded in the earth. When the team left that autumn, they sealed the locket in the university archives with care. The project concluded successfully, yet the phenomenon around it persisted. Students who catalogued the artifacts reported faint singing in the storage rooms at night. Security guards heard a woman's voice humming by the door before it fell silent. Dr. Shaw brushed off the claims with practicality, until one afternoon, while preparing a lecture, she opened the storage file containing Miriam's locket. The metal, though kept in climate-controlled cases, had grown warm in her palm. Years passed. The research faded from public curiosity. The world turned its attention elsewhere. But for Dr. Shaw, the voice never left entirely. It lingered at the edge of hearing whenever she passed a window during storms or when she replayed her old tapes. What began as a historical fascination grew into something personal, a connection she couldn't explain but didn't fear. One night in 2024, during a particularly heavy rain, Shaw sat alone in her office, reviewing her old field journals. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the city, echoing like the distant heartbeat of the land. She turned toward the recorder still resting on her shelf, the same one she'd used at Holt Hollow. On impulse, she pressed play. The tape clicked, and for a few seconds there was only static. Then faintly, that same slow, mournful counting began once more. This time the voice was clearer, older, deeper. Shaw realized it wasn't just repetition. Each number carried a pause, a breath, a wait. When the count reached 1,000, it stopped. Silence followed, dense and absolute, as if the recording itself had taken a breath. Then came a whisper. "Thank you." That single phrase froze her in place. Her heart raced, but she felt no fear, only overwhelming sadness. Shaw replayed the tape twice, but the whisper never returned. It remained a one-time farewell, woven into the hum of rain and memory. In the years that followed, Dr. Evelyn Shaw became known for her quiet lectures about the moral duty of remembrance. "History breathes," she told her students. "It's not the ghosts of the past that haunt us. It's our refusal to listen." The legend of Miriam Holt transformed in her telling, from a tale of mourning and revenge into one of endurance, of a woman who had carried her grief across centuries so that it might one day be understood. Today, locals still speak her name gently. They say she is no longer crying under the cypress trees. Sometimes, on still nights along the Oconee River, people claim they hear a voice humming, light and far away, not sorrowful now, but peaceful, as if the burden she bore has at last been laid to rest. And though her body was never found, her story has taken root deeper than any grave could reach. Miriam Holt is remembered not as the ghost of the marshlands, but as the echo of truth itself, the woman who bore witness when the world refused to see. Her voice lingers whenever rain falls on Georgia soil, a reminder that some names once spoken with care never fade. When the wind sweeps through the cypress grove now, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine, it sounds less like crying and more like breathing. The fire that once swallowed her world has cooled, but its warmth still glows below the surface, carrying forward one message, whispered through the centuries by the woman who mourned 1,000 husbands. That memory, when honored, can turn even grief into light. By the spring of 2026, the Oconee Highway stood completed at last. Where the Holt plantation had once risen from the red Georgia clay, a ribbon of gray asphalt now cut through the wetlands, humming day and night with passing vehicles. Most commuters sped across that stretch without a thought for what lay beneath their tires. But some truckers, mostly those who drove after midnight, whispered that the air along that mile felt different. The headlights seemed weaker there, the sound of engines muffled, as if the world paused to listen to something older. They called that bit of road Miriam's Mile. The name began as a joke among local truckers, but it soon took root beyond their circle. Radios occasionally picked up a faint frequency when passing through, an untraceable voice, humming a slow, wordless tune. The county inspection teams blamed interference from an old power line. Nobody wanted to link it to the legend that had hung like mist over the region for nearly 2 centuries. Yet, for one man, the legend wasn't a story. Henry Whitaker was the grandson of a sharecropper who had once worked land neighboring the old Holt fields. At 63, Henry drove freight across the south, often through that same section of highway. He'd grown up listening to his grandmother speak about the woman who cried for the lost ones. As a boy, he'd laughed at the stories. As a man, he'd learned how history buries guilt under silence. That spring, he decided to stop at the rest area near Miriam's Mile, the one with the faded marker commemorating the Oconee River settlement. The marker made no mention of Miriam Holt or the fire, just names of white settlers, cotton yields, and trade routes. To Henry, that omission always felt cruel. He parked his truck, lit a cigarette, and stared out toward the faint outline of the cypress grove, still visible under the thin drizzle. The trees leaned toward one another as though sharing secrets. The river nearby was swollen with rain, carrying bits of old wood and leaves downstream. Somewhere beyond that line of trees was the land where Miriam had lived, mourned, and vanished. Henry wasn't sure why he went closer that night. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt. Maybe the quiet in the air felt like someone asking to be remembered. He walked until the grass softened beneath his boots and the mist thickened. The ground exhaled the scent of mud and decay. He saw what looked like the faint shape of an old stone wall, half buried and covered in moss. Then came the sound, low at first, rising slowly, steady and human. A hum. The same tune his grandmother used to lull him to sleep when the world outside felt cruel. He froze. The air was heavy, thick with moisture, every breath visible. The hum drifted closer, and for an instant he thought he saw movement, a flicker of white amidst the black trunks of the cypress. Instinct told him to back away, but another part of him, the part that believed in history, kept him rooted. "Miss Miriam," he said softly, words trembling in the rain. "We ain't forgot you." "Not anymore." The humming faltered, then fell silent. A moment stretched, long and still. Then the faint rustle of wind passed through the grove, carrying voices too quiet to be clear. Henry felt tears burn his eyes, though he couldn't say why. He left the place just before dawn, the wet grass seeping into his boots as the first light crept across the highway. A week later, he told his story on a local radio show that featured Southern folklore. His voice, rough, honest, made an impression. Callers began sharing similar experiences, headlights dimming at the same spot, songs fading into static, a smell of smoke after rain. One woman described seeing a figure standing by the water's edge, barefoot still, her hands clasped around something small that reflected the light. "She didn't scare me," the caller said. "She looked tired but peaceful, like somebody finally guarding what's left of her." The host, a skeptic, laughed politely, but the phones kept ringing. By summer, Miriam's Mile had become a roadside curiosity. Tourists passed through hoping for chills, snapping pictures near the cypress grove. Vendors began selling charms and postcards bearing her name. The story that had survived through whispers was now dressed in neon colors and souvenir trinkets. Henry didn't return. He hated what it had become, a spectacle instead of remembrance. He started writing letters to anyone who would listen. Local papers, the County Heritage Council, even the university that had excavated the site years earlier. His plea was simple: build her a memorial not for tourists but for truth. "She carried the grief of those who couldn't speak," he wrote. "The least we can do is give her a voice now." Months passed with no reply. Then in October, Dr. Evelyn Shaw reached out. She remembered Henry's grandmother's name from archives. She had once been interviewed in the 1970s Oral History Project. Shaw invited Henry to collaborate on a memorial proposal, a monument not just to Miriam, but to every enslaved soul whose story had been buried under silence. The project began with a single stone. They set it at the edge of the grove, midway between the old foundations and the new highway. The inscription was simple: Here lies the memory of Miriam Holt, who mourned those the world forgot. The unveiling took place under pale autumn skies. A handful of locals gathered, joined by students, truckers, and descendants of families once bound to the land. No speeches, no cameras, just silence, then a single hymn sung softly by the crowd. When the last note faded, a breeze swept through the grove, rustling the leaves like applause. That night, travelers on Miriam's Mile reported that the air felt lighter than usual. The static on their radios was gone. One driver, passing through at midnight, said he saw no figure this time, only a faint glow through the mist, lingering like the last embers of a dying fire. Dr. Shaw later wrote in her journal that it wasn't about closure because history doesn't close. It simply learns to breathe again. We gave her a name aloud, she wrote, and sometimes that's all it takes for peace. Henry returned one final time the following spring. The grove was quiet except for birds. The marble stone stood partly mossed, its letters weathering gently into the earth. He placed a folded note at its base, his grandmother's lullaby written from memory, and whispered goodbye. As he walked back toward his truck, thunder rumbled faintly on the horizon, not as menace but as a reminder. The air seemed warmer, the road ahead open. Behind him, the wind moved softly through the cypress trees, carrying the faint echo of a hum, not sorrowful now but almost content, as if Miriam herself was finally resting between the roots and the rain. Those who pass that stretch today, whether they know her story or not, are met with a quietness that feels almost sacred. The road still hums, the trees still sway, and sometimes when the sky turns the color of old ash, the ground beneath seems to breathe. It is said that if you listen without fear, the hum becomes a heartbeat, and in that rhythm lives every voice she ever mourned, every soul she refused to let the world forget. In the years that followed the unveiling of Miriam Holt's memorial, the story began to travel farther than it ever had before. It spread across state lines, reappearing in documentaries, podcasts, and school lessons about forgotten histories. Yet wherever the story reached, one thing remained unchanged. Those who came to the grove spoke of a strange calm, as if the air there carried both mourning and mercy in the same breath. By 2028, the small patch of land once called Holt Hollow had become part of a protected historical reserve. Visitors needed permission to walk the old trail marked by sinking stones and tangled roots. Around the memorial stood signs that told the truth: the fire of 1841, the lives erased, the name of the woman who refused to vanish into silence. People came from all over to leave offerings, flowers, handwritten notes, and often keys. No one knew why the keys started appearing, but soon they became a symbol of freedom unlocked too late. Among the visitors was a young historian named Marcus Reed, a graduate student from Atlanta, working on his thesis about the oral traditions of the enslaved South. He had read about Miriam Holt in the research of the late Dr. Evelyn Shaw, who had passed away the previous winter. Reed admired her deeply, regarding her as one of the few who treated the legend not as superstition, but as living testimony. When he was offered access to her archived recordings for academic study, he accepted immediately. Most of the material was familiar: journal entries, survey maps, fragments of dialogue from interviews. But then he found one tape unlisted in the university database. It was labeled only with a single word: here. When he played it, static filled the air, rhythmic and low, almost like wind through hollow metal. Then came faint humming, followed by the voice of a woman whispering numbers, slow and deliberate. The tone shifted near the end, forming a sound that could almost be a sigh followed by silence. Then, without warning, a soft, frail voice spoke words that chilled the room. "You are listening still." Marcus froze. It wasn't Shaw's voice. The recording cut abruptly after that. He replayed it several times, but the whisper never came again. Unsure whether it was interference or an intentional message, he transcribed every sound, noting the exact timestamps. Later, he noticed that each pause between numbers matched the rhythm of a human heartbeat. Driven by curiosity, he visited the site that weekend to see the memorial for himself. The road was quiet, heavy with summer heat. When he reached the grove, a haze hovered above the water, diffusing the sunlight into a dull golden mist. The stone marker gleamed softly, half covered with lichen, surrounded by keys and letters left by strangers. He placed one of his own, just a note: "We're still listening." He stayed until dusk, reading fragments left behind by others. One was a poem written in careful handwriting. She counted us one by one until the silence became mercy. Another was a drawing of cypress trees shading a single room of fire. They all spoke of her as though she was still keeping watch. When night fell, Marcus heard the sound of distant thunder rolling off the marshlands. He felt the instinct to leave, but something in the air rooted him in place. Then the hum began, faint but steady, drifting from the direction of the old foundations. It wasn't mournful this time, just low and constant, a melody carrying weight, like the voice of memory itself. He turned on his small recorder, whispering, "Miriam, if you can hear me, we remember." The sound of the wind seemed to answer, soft at first, then stronger, swirling through the trees, bending the reeds along the water. The hum rose, layered now with multiple tones like a distant choir. He realized it wasn't one voice, but many, overlapping in harmony and grief. The air shimmered faintly, bending the moonlight around the grove. Marcus felt his pulse rise but stayed still. A warmth spread across his chest, and for a fleeting second he felt the sensation of hands against his shoulders, neither heavy nor frightening, just steady. And in that moment the hum turned into words, not in his ears but inside him, deep and calm. "Don't bury us again." The wind ceased. Fireflies blinked to life across the reeds, hundreds of them lighting the space where the air had trembled moments before. Marcus knew then that the story was not complete, that it was never meant to end as legend or lesson. It was a conversation, one the living were responsible for continuing. He stayed at the site until the first light of dawn, then left with the hum still echoing in his mind. When he returned to the city, he pored through historical records, searching for documentation of other plantations destroyed by accidental fires. He found more than a dozen entries matching the same time frame, each followed by rows of unnamed casualties. It wasn't a pattern of tragedy. It was a pattern of silence. Weeks later, Marcus published a paper not about ghosts but about remembrance. He wrote that some voices survive not through haunting, but through persistence, that to listen is to honor and to honor is to heal. His work earned critical recognition, yet he felt uneasy accepting credit. In every word he wrote, he felt Miriam's presence reminding him of a truth larger than research. Grief unacknowledged becomes a shadow that keeps walking beside the living. The grove remained quiet after that. The reports of strange sounds lessened, though travelers still stopped sometimes, leaving keys or flowers at the marker. The county eventually installed a plaque quoting Shaw, "History breathes." Tourists came and went, but locals said that those who linger long enough, those who walk without speaking, might feel the faintest pressure of a hand, guiding them gently back to the road. Every spring when the cypress bloomed, the mist would hang heavy over the river, sometimes catching the sunrise in a shimmer of gold. And if the wind blew from the east, a faint sound would travel through Holt Hollow, not crying, not humming, but something softer, like a sigh of relief. Those who believed said that the souls Miriam had counted were no longer restless, that the 1,000 names had finally been spoken, and she was free to rest among them. But others, like Marcus, thought differently. He believed she was still there, not bound by sorrow, but anchored by remembrance, guarding the truth she had carried for too long alone. Now, when locals drive past the grove, they lower their voices. Some turn off the radio out of instinct. Others whisper her name like a prayer. Even those who claim disbelief often glance toward the trees, feeling that small ripple of stillness that lingers behind memory's curtain. For though the road runs straight and the marsh spreads wide, there is a place where history still stands watch, and in the breath between thunder and silence, in that hush of air over water, Miriam Holt's story continues to speak, gentle and unending, reminding Georgia and all who pass that the past is never gone. It waits, patient and listening, beneath the cypress trees. By 2030, the Holt Memorial had become more than a historical landmark. It was now a place of reflection, visited by scholars, artists, families, and wanderers. The path that led to the grove was narrow but well kept, bordered by wooden lanterns that flickered at dusk. The air there always seemed different, thicker somehow, like a breath held long before a word that needed to be spoken. Visitors said it wasn't haunted. It was alive with listening. Each spring, the local community hosted a remembrance ceremony called the Counting. It was never advertised or written about. Word passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor. At sunset, people gathered near the grove and read aloud the names of enslaved men and women recovered from nearby plantations. The readings stretched through the night, but when the last voice finished, the silence that followed was never empty. It trembled, as if something answered back, unheard but deeply felt. For many, it was a way to honor Miriam Holt's legacy, the woman who had mourned every stolen life, who had counted loss until her own name became a prayer. She had become the unseen choirmaster of that ceremony, the spirit of memory binding generations together. Among those who returned every year was Marcus Reed. Since publishing his research, his life had changed. He lectured across the country, not only about slavery, but about the power of oral memory, the way grief, when shared, could transform history. Every time he spoke her name aloud, he felt that small tremor in his chest, like a quiet pulse that didn't belong to him but refused to fade. On the 5th anniversary of the memorial, he came back to the grove carrying a new project, a sculpture bearing 1,000 etched marks, each representing the unnamed dead of the Oconee region. He set it opposite her stone, facing the rising sun. Instead of names, it was carved with light, grooves meant to catch dawn's first rays so that every morning the memory of those unseen would briefly shimmer gold. At the ceremony that year, the weather seemed oddly familiar. Heavy clouds gathered over the horizon, and the air pressed close like breath before thunder. The community read their lists in quiet unison. When they reached the last line, the 1,000th mark on the sculpture, the first drops of rain began to fall. No one moved. They stood together, letting the storm soak through their clothes, as if to remind themselves that remembrance required discomfort. That memory was not always soft. Marcus stayed behind after the others left, notebook in hand. The rain eased into mist and the grove seemed to exhale. From the trees came a sound, not humming this time, but faint speech, so light he thought he imagined it. "You kept your promise," it said, almost lost to the wind. He turned, eyes scanning the shadows, but saw nothing except fireflies drifting like sparks. That night he couldn't sleep. Back in his motel room, he opened his notebook to write and found faint wet marks on the page, as though raindrops had fallen in the shape of fingerprints. There was no window nearby. He wrote in the margin, "She is not gone. She endures in the breath between silence and recognition." The next morning, the community erected a small wooden bench facing the grove. Families began sitting there for hours, speaking softly or saying nothing at all. Sometimes children left notes in the hollows of the trees. One note, preserved years later, read, "If you see my granddaddy, tell him we're free now." Another simply said, "Thank you for remembering us." Over the years, stories multiplied. Hikers claimed they saw the trees move without wind, branches bending above them as though in greeting. Others said they felt warmth at their backs, like sunlight through clouds even on grey days. A few reported hearing the same lullaby, a soft tune with no words, carried faintly across the marsh. Nobody ever felt fear, only a solemn respect, the kind that filled space between heartbeat and breath. By 2033, interest in the Holt site grew beyond Georgia. Academic conferences cited it as an example of restorative memory. Documentaries captured the landscape at dawn, mist floating over the cypress roots, the reflection of the sculpture glinting like fire on water. Some accused filmmakers of using artificial light, but those who visited swore the glow came naturally when the sun rose at exactly the right angle. Marcus returned again, older now, his hair streaked with grey. Standing before the memorial, he whispered the same words she had once spoken in the legend's oldest version, "You promised me forever." But now, the words no longer belonged to grief. They belonged to perseverance, to the continuing chain of remembrance stretching from Miriam's unseen hands to every person who spoke her name. He read aloud from his journal. "She counted the lost until she became their voice. We count them now to remind the world that love, bound by absence, can outlast whole empires." When he closed his book, the wind stirred through the grove as though approving, and for a brief moment, the faint shimmer of heat rose from the soil, just enough to catch the light, like an ember that refused to cool. Time passed again, as it always does. Decades would eventually turn the story into part of Georgia's official history, taught in classrooms, written in textbooks, but the locals never let it become sterile. They still held the ceremony in silence, still felt the pulse of presence between the trees. In those quiet nights, when thunder rolled far away yet close enough to shake loose old echoes, the people who tended the grove said they sometimes heard counting again, not anguished, not desperate, but gentle, patient. 1,000 names whispered like prayer beads through the dark, finishing always with one last sound like an exhale. They said that was Miriam keeping the promise she'd begun 190 years before. At the edge of the marsh, the cypress trees have grown thicker, their roots binding around the ancient stones that once marked the plantation's heart. The soil is rich, darker than the land around it, nourished by everything once broken. Spring wildflowers bloom earlier there, their colors more vivid as if drawn upward by unseen warmth. Travelers who walk that path feel the shift immediately, the soft pressure of stillness, the rhythm in their bones. Some say they can sense an invisible choir surrounding them. Others, the skeptics, leave unsettled but quiet, unable to name what they felt. The grove requires no belief, only listening. And if one stands there at dawn, when the mist begins to thin and the water mirrors the pale sky, the light falls in such a way that it seems to reveal faint outlines within the fog, shapes of people standing shoulder to shoulder, facing east. They vanish as quickly as they appear, leaving only ripples where their reflections had stood. But even after they're gone, the echo of their presence remains like breath against glass. This is what the locals mean when they say that Miriam Holt still keeps count, that her song is not about death, but endurance. She no longer cries under the cypress trees. She listens, names still forming in the wind, and every whispered syllable adds one more voice to the 1,000 who walk unseen beside her. Together, they remind the living that remembrance is not mourning. It is the continuation of life itself, stretching beyond silence into forever. By 2040, the Oconee River had changed its course again, swallowing part of the old road and carving a new curve through the landscape where the Holt plantation once stood. The highway now skirted the edges of the wetlands, and only a narrow causeway remained where drivers could glimpse the ghostly shimmer of the cypress grove. The memorial had aged gently. Moss had softened the letters of Miriam Holt's name, but the stone still stood firm, resisting time as it always had. Those who visited said the place felt heavier now, but not in sorrow. It was the weight of peace settling over land that had once known unspeakable pain. The field that had burned in 1841 had grown fertile again, filled with tall grass that waved like a sea of silver beneath the morning sun. Locals said the wind moved differently there, slower, as though respecting what it passed through. The community kept the tradition of the counting. Each year at dawn they gathered, descendants and strangers alike, reading names both found and lost. No one ever spoke afterward. The silence itself became part of the ceremony. In that stillness, people said you could feel it, the quiet hum of gratitude, the echo of all those voices that once cried across the plantation's fields, now soft, gentle, unburdened. Marcus Reed, now elderly and nearly retired, returned that spring for what he knew would be his final visit. His hands trembled from age, but his steps remained steady as he walked the familiar path through the grove. The air smelled of rain and river reeds. The sun was low behind veils of mist, giving everything a golden hue. He sat on the weathered bench near the stone and listened to the faint sounds of the world waking. When he placed his hand on the memorial, warmth spread through his palm, a steady, living warmth. He smiled, not startled. He'd come to believe that sensations like that were answers, not mysteries. He whispered the same words he had written years ago. "We did not bury you. We remembered." Birdsong cut through the moment. The sound was light, almost musical, like an echo repeating across decades. Marcus closed his eyes and saw faces, not ghosts but imagined souls, the 1,000 who had walked unseen behind Miriam's voice. In that vision she stood among them, calm and proud, the faintest curve of a smile gracing her face. She held her locket close and turned toward the horizon where morning light met water. Then she opened her hand, and both she and the locket dissolved into light, scattering across the surface like sparks meeting the river's skin. When he opened his eyes again, the grove was still. Yet something had shifted. The usual dampness of the earth felt dry beneath him, warm like summer turned inward. He took a final photograph, the sunlight slipping through the branches, casting the shadow of the tree line over the memorial so that, for a brief moment, Miriam's name glowed brighter than the stone around it. That image would later circulate beyond the county, captioned simply, "The river remembers." No one could explain the odd light that seemed to rise from the ground, nor why the structure behind the bench appeared faintly reflected in the air, like a double exposure. Scientists called it a trick of humidity. The locals called it proof of presence. Months after Marcus passed away, his papers were donated to the university. Among his final writings was a letter addressed to the living. It read in part, "We inherit not only blood and freedom, but also silence. Miriam taught us that silence can either bury or bloom. When you stand by the water and hear your own heartbeat echoing through the trees, that is history speaking back, asking whether you've learned to listen." The letter ended without signature, as though he intended the message to belong to everyone. By the late 2040s, nature reclaimed more of Holt Hollow. The cypress roots reached deeper, gripping what little remained of the old foundation. Visitors found the paths partially flooded, and reeds rose taller than a person's head. Still, people came quietly, reverently, to sit near the water, to leave keys, notes, or simply to breathe. The site had become less a monument and more a sanctuary, a small living wound turned into grace. The water glowed faintly at dusk, reflecting sunsets in shades of amber that looked like fire reborn as light. Some evenings, when fog drifted low and the cicadas fell silent, travelers swore they heard singing, not words, not melody, just the long, low sound of breath blending with the wind. It was said that each tone carried a memory, the laughter of children who never grew old, the prayers of mothers whispered in secret, the heartbeat of men dreaming of escape. All of it intertwined, woven into the hum that had once been Miriam Holt's lament. Generations later, a small museum would open by the new highway to preserve what remained of the story. In its center stood the sculpture Marcus had created, the 1,000 grooves catching the morning sun. The exhibit featured only a single recording, discovered years later among Shaw's archived materials. It played faint static followed by a whisper, the same words she had once heard on tape. "Thank you." Visitors listened in silence, headphones pressed close, some weeping quietly, others smiling through tears. Outside, engraved in bronze above the exit, the museum carried a line taken from Miriam's story itself. "We are remembered by the sound of our silence." The locals, still caretakers at heart, never stopped gathering each spring. They said that as long as a voice spoke her name, the grove would remain, a place where the earth kept its own heartbeat, where the past and present met without fear. In the distance, the highway lights shimmered faintly over the water, reflecting like small stars across the marsh. Drivers passing through late at night sometimes glimpsed something impossible to explain, shapes shimmering at the edge of the road, standing close together as though in vigil, all facing east toward first light. Some slowed down out of instinct, not from fear but out of reverence, whispering apologies into the wind without knowing why. Those who live nearby have no doubt what those travelers see. They say it's the 1,000 husbands Miriam once mourned, walking finally in peace beside her, their shadows steady in the river light. They walk not to haunt but to remind, the living and the land, that grief can become memory, and memory, when spoken with love, can become freedom. And so, each morning when sunlight filters through the mist and warms the moss-covered stones, her voice rises again, not a cry, not a song, but a sigh breathed through the cypress trees, the sigh of a woman who counted every name until the counting became eternal, the sigh of a place that finally forgave itself, the sigh of life continuing, unchanged yet redeemed. It is said that if you stand there long enough, the wind carries your name too, folding it gently into the chorus that has never stopped moving through time. For the land remembers, the water repeats, and under the roots of the trees, Miriam Holt still keeps her promise, mourning no longer but watching forever in the light of the river. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.